Hey everyone, and welcome to the Retro Channel, and here I have a whole stack of Super Nintendo boards to repair. Why do I have so many? Well, let's just say late nights, eBay, a little bit of alcohol, this is what happens. So yeah, as some of you might notice, these are original SHVC boards, so they're the first revision Super Nintendo boards to come out, and they all have this little external sound module box. Later board revisions, like this one here, came with the sound chips built into the main board, whereas with these ones, the sound chips are contained inside this little box, which is actually removable. Now, as you can see, I've already done some work on most of these boards by the looks of it. It was about a year ago, so I don't really remember where I was up to, but it looks like I've written notes on what the failures were on each one. Some of them don't say anything though, so let's just start with this one over here, see if there's actually something wrong with it, and just go through the basic troubleshooting steps that you should do with any Super Nintendo or Super Famicom, and if there's deeper issues, then we'll try and work out which chip might be the potential failure point, and see if we can swap it over for a working one. Alright, let's start with the basic troubleshooting. So we will need to plug in this switch in order to turn the machine on. For the power supply, I'm using an aftermarket one, so this is a triad power supply. It outputs 9 volts DC at a maximum of 2.5 amps, and it is center negative. So most power supplies these days are center positive. You want to make sure for the Super Nintendo that you get something that is center negative. If you have a power Super Nintendo, then you can use either the original AC or a DC power supply, and the polarity doesn't matter because these boards all have a bridge rectifier on them, so it's going to come out the same way onto the board. But you cannot use that for the US or the Japanese Super Nintendos. You must use a 9 volt center negative power supply. Seeing as we're starting off the power supply, let's just measure it. So I'll put the negative probe in here and positive on the outside, and we're seeing 9.17 volts DC. Perfect. Let's plug in a controller port. You don't necessarily need to have this plugged in, but it does come in handy because it actually has the power LED on it, so it's an easy way to see if the board's actually powering up. And in fact, let's just plug it in and see what happens. Yes, so our LED is lighting up. That means we're at least getting 5 volt power to the main board. If the LED doesn't light up, obviously make sure your power supply is working, but failing that, you can check the fuse here for continuity, so just check across these 2 points. Obviously make sure this is unplugged before you do that. And if that's intact, you can check the voltage regulator here for the correct voltages. So this is pretty easy to check with the multimeter. We'll just power the machine on, stick our negative probe on any ground point, and on the leftmost pin of the voltage regulator should be our input voltage. So yeah, 8.6 volts, anything between 8 and 10 volts should be fine. And on the output here, we should see our 5 volts, 5.06, perfectly fine. If you don't see any voltage on the input, then suspect either the fuse or perhaps your power supply, maybe even the switch, or the DC barrel jack that goes in at the back here. You might have broken solder joints on it. If you're seeing nothing on the output, then definitely suspect the voltage regulator itself or something on the board that's pulling a whole lot of current, in which case it's going to drop that voltage. That's pretty unlikely, and you'll know pretty quickly just from touching everything that something is getting super duper hot. So at this point we know we've got good power. Let's hook up a video cable and stick in a cartridge. Keep in mind the video cables for the Super Nintendo do differ between PAL and NTSC units, so you want to make sure that you've got the right one. And the Super Nintendo can output RF, composite, S-video, and RGB, but you need the right cable for that. So this is obviously RGB SCART cable, and with any luck this should work, but that's another troubleshooting step you can do, is suspect your video cable. Let's try it with RGB, see if that works. If it doesn't, then I'll try it with, say, composite, because it actually runs through a different circuit on the board, and you may find that while RGB doesn't work, composite does, or maybe composite doesn't work, but S-video does. So it's worth having multiple video cables because sometimes that can help you track down the actual fault. This video is sponsored by PCBWay, who have now extended their 10th anniversary promotion until the end of August. So there's never been a better time to head over to PCBWay and score yourself some free coupons. While you're there, why not check out their shared projects section, where you'll find all kinds of fantastic projects from members of the community, and ordering is as simple as hitting add to cart, selecting the quantity you would like, and selecting your preferred color. And within no time at all, you'll have high quality PCBs made by PCBWay arriving on your doorstep. So thank you to PCBWay for sponsoring this video. Now before I plug a cartridge in, it is worth just checking the cartridge port, and I've just realized this one says missing pin on the front. So obviously this isn't going to work. The good thing about these older units is this just pulls off. This is opposed to some of the later boards where the cartridge connector is actually soldered to the board. So this does not come off, and yes, I did write soldered there because I was trying to pull at this thing and it wouldn't budge. So for now, we'll just borrow this off another board, and yeah, you want to check both the pins underneath and the pins on the inside of the cartridge connector and the pins on the board. I'd recommend just giving these a clean as a matter of course. So I'm just going to use a cotton bud and some 99% IPA. Probably shouldn't have plugged all this in first. So just going to gently go across these pins. And obviously do the back side. And while you've got the cartridge port off, it is just worth checking these traces underneath here, just to make sure none of them are turning black, because that's usually the first sign of corrosion. In this case, all the traces there look good, so that should be fine. Let's clean up the cartridge port itself. So once again, just get in here with some IPA. Just go over those pins. And for the top side, obviously, if you put a cotton bud in there, it's just going to get snagged on all those pins. So I'd recommend just some regular contact cleaner for this. In this case, I have the ChemTools contact cleaner lubricant, but you can use deoxit or whatever you can find. And I'll just spray a little bit in there. It's quite messy. All right, finally, we're ready to test this thing. Just wanted to get all those basic troubleshooting steps out of the way. Obviously, for the rest of the systems, I'll skip over that stuff unless I find something interesting. Let's give this a go. So this will just snap back on, and then we can just plug in everything else. And now we can throw in a cartridge. So the first one I'm going to start with is the Super Nintendo burn-in cassette. So this is basically a test cartridge, and you can find these pretty cheaply on AliExpress. You can also use a regular game cartridge if you've got one of those handy, but this is much better if you're trying to troubleshoot a particular system. You can actually find the ROM image of these online and stick that onto something like an Everdrive, but keep in mind this thing has to boot its own menu system first, and that may fail to load up, whereas on this original cartridge or reproduction cartridge, it doesn't have to load up that menu system, so you may find that one of these will work on a broken Super Nintendo, whereas the Everdrive won't. So let's throw our burn-in cartridge in, and probably should connect a controller. Let's see if this Super Nintendo has actually got a problem. Okay, well, I'm getting no video output, so that's a problem. Is it just my dodgy cable? Oh, there we go. Now it's working. So could have just been a bad connection on the cartridge port. Seems okay now though. So there's a few options here. The main one we're interested in is the burn-in test, because this will test most of the chips on the board and tell us if there's a failure with one of them. So let's start that, see what it does. Okay, looks like everything passed. We may not be out of the woods yet. There could still be an issue with this board, and it's something that the burn-in test isn't picking up on. So say if you've got a problem with the video output or the audio output, usually the burn-in test is not going to be able to catch that because it's relying on feedback from the other chips on the board. So if it's on an output stage, it's not going to know about it. We could sit here and watch this burn-in test run its course. You may spot, say, a graphical issue in there, but I find that running certain games is a much better test for this. So let's pop this out. And this is where an Everdrive cartridge really comes in handy, so we'll stick that in and power it on, see if it manages to boot. And I'm just getting flashing lights on the Everdrive, which is not correct. Oh, there we go, reseating it worked. So may need to do a little bit more. In fact, I shouldn't use that. I should use the burn-in cartridge. I just have some bad contacts in that cartridge port, so a little bit of that might solve it. Let's try that again. All right, that looks better. So I've found there are a few games that will usually show some underlying faults where the burn-in test doesn't, and the main one I like to use is Super Mario Kart. So everything looks mostly okay, but I do see some flickering around the top of the screen. That could just be down to bad capacitors. I'd highly recommend recapping any Super Nintendo that you come across these days because the capacitors on these are failing, but I'm not sure. It looks like I've already done it with this one. We'll check that out in a second, but yeah, there is some weird distortion at the top of the screen. It sort of comes and goes. Apart from that, I'm not seeing any other graphical corruption though, so that's a good sign. Star Fox is another good one to do a test with. And again, we're seeing little glitches around the top of the screen, so it's definitely something not quite right about this Super Nintendo. So let's unplug everything and take a closer look at this board. To remove the heatsink here, there's a screw holding the voltage regulator on and a couple of screws around the outside edge. Alright, yes, I've definitely recapped this board. These are all new capacitors, so it's definitely not going to be those. And yes, the solder joints on all of them are good. I don't worry too much about the big through-hole capacitor, and I think on the North American Super Nintendos, some of them don't even have this capacitor on the board. It is more these surface mount capacitors that are a major concern, and on a lot of these boards they've already started leaking, and some of them have caused some pretty major damage. But on this board, I don't see any trace damage, and that is the next thing to check with these things before you go suspecting any chips, is damaged traces, because a lot of these, they were in kids' houses and, either drinks or something got spilt on them, and over the years that can actually get into the traces and start corroding the copper. So the best thing to do with these after you've recapped them is to look for any damaged traces. So the main thing we're looking for here is any traces or any of these wires that have turned black, and I'm not seeing any of that happening on this board. I do have an example though, and this is one of the boards that is still yet to be looked at, but if we look on this area that I've circled here, there is one trace there that has turned dark, so that's the kind of thing that we're looking for, and we'll see if that trace is still intact when we get to this board. But as for this one, I don't see any major issues. So the next thing to check is just our connections on all these ICs, just to make sure all the pins look like they're touching the board, none of them have bent up or bent to the side, and they're all making good contact. And I do see a couple that don't look right. This might be a job for the microscope. Now, if you don't have a microscope, you may be able to get by with just a magnifying glass or one of those jeweler's loupes, or even just the camera on your mobile phone just zoomed in a little bit. But on this one, it looks like on PPU2 here, this leg right here, oh yes, that is loose. That is just flapping about. And this leg up here, maybe that one's connected. So I'm going to throw some no clean liquid flux on here. This is the MG Chemicals stuff. I'm going to get a tiny bit of solder on the tip of my soldering iron, not too much, and we'll just touch the pad and the pin. I have to flip this way. Here we go. And we'll do the same on this guy. It's probably hard to tell from this angle, but if we just give these a bit of a nudge, that is now solid, and that one was already connected before it seemed, but yeah, it's definitely not going anywhere now. So it may well be that loose pin was the cause of all our problems, especially given it's on the PPU or picture processing chip, or at least one of them. So that obviously handles the video output and would lead to graphical corruption, potentially. So I'll just throw this heatsink back on. I'll just put a couple of screws just to hold it in place because that voltage regulator will get very toasty very quickly without it. And of course we need to put our sound module back on, otherwise it probably won't boot at all. All right. Oh, it still works, so that's nice. Ooh. I'm still seeing glitching up the top. Oh, and a little bit in the middle as well, maybe. So perhaps I should try a different video output. Like I said, these do RGB, composite, S-video, and RF, and certain issues will affect one but not the other. So let's try it out with S-video. This very janky cable that I have here is actually for PAL machines. I'm hoping that'll at least work with NTSC. I guess there's only one way to find out. Probably should use my little video debug board to see what the signals look like from this, but what's the worst that could happen? Okay, it actually looks fine. Ah, well, I didn't even need to load up the game. I can still see that glitching at the top of the screen. So, I don't think it's a video cable issue. There is something wrong on this board. So I've had the system running for about 10 minutes just looking at different games, and now it seems to be fine. So maybe this is a temperature related issue. So we'll go at this with the old freezer spray, just cooling down various components, see if it makes any difference. Start with the CPU. Still looks fine. Right, I'm just going to fast forward through this part because, to be honest, it wasn't very exciting. Basically what I did was go around the board just cooling each component one by one to seeing if it made any difference, and long story short, it didn't. Well, maybe I was wrong about heating and cooling. It still just seems to have random glitches that sometimes just aren't there. I don't know if it's a timing issue, maybe it's a horizontal or vertical sync issue. But there's also graphical corruption sometimes, which makes me think it's not one of those things. I think it's PPU2 that handles most of the video synchronization. I guess we can also check the clock timing, because I'm pretty sure we can do that with the SD to SNES. So let's see. Yes, so it's saying it's running at 21.4783 megahertz. SNES Master Clock runs at 21.477 megahertz, or 1.89 to the 1,000 million or whatever, over 88 hertz. Looks like the exact rate would be 21.477.272. So I guess we can try adjusting that with this little trimmer next to the crystal here. See if we can get it any closer. It's going up. Well, that's now pretty close, and I can still see those glitches there, so I don't think the Super Nintendo is that sensitive to the clock frequency. Yeah, looking at the pinout for PPU2 by Jonathan Donaldson, pin 25 and 26 are horizontal blanking and vertical blanking, and there is also a field pin, which I guess would be odd and even fields. So yeah, maybe PPU2 could be on the fritz. I think what I'm going to do before I try and replace it is just go around, give all the pins a reflow, see if that changes anything at all. Right, that is it. Just a little bit of no clean flux and just run the soldering iron over all those pins, making sure they all get a nice sufficient heating. I didn't add any extra solder. Just let the existing solder get reflowed. Just check it under the microscope real quick. And I just realized I didn't hit record when I last showed the microscope bit. Oops. Well, anyway, what I did show on the microscope last time is that I think it was this pin here and this pin here looked a bit dodgy, and this one actually wasn't connected. I could just push it around with the tweezers. So what I did the first time was reflow that pin, and then they were solid, and I just went around checking to make sure all the other pins were also solid. So yeah, sorry about not shooting that first part. I totally forgot to hit record on this thing. Anyway, now that they've all been reflowed, let's just make sure they're all solid and we don't have any bridges. In fact, bridges are pretty easy to spot at this magnification, and yeah, definitely no bridges there. Oh, all those pins are solid. Yeah, and nice and shiny too. Don't see any issues around PPU 1 either. No, I'd say that's fine. If this doesn't work this time, we'll swap PPU 2, I think. It's still got problems. It looks like on the schematics that horizontal and vertical blanking go from PPU2, so out of PPU2 and over to the CPU. I still suspect PPU2 to be the fault here. I suppose it could be something with the video encoder chip as well. Well, as I'm not certain if it's going to be PPU2 on this board, and I don't have a spare one at the moment, I think we'll go on to the next board, see what the faults are there. I'm sure at some point we'll end up with a board that's just beyond repair or something, and we can harvest a PPU2 off that. But I'm reluctant to take this one off without knowing for sure that that's what's causing the problem. Usually most faults with these are a little bit more obvious than this one, so suspecting PPU2, but not sure at this point. So let's move on to the next board. We'll come back to this one later. Just going to put a little question. So I know this has been recapped probably when I did the other one, so we'll just say sometime last year. Random video glitch. PPU 2. Right, we'll leave this one like that for now. Let's move on to the next board. Alright, it is a couple of days later, and that gave me a little bit of time to think about the issue with this board, and I think I may have a solution for it. So we're not going to move on to the next one yet. I think we may be able to fix this one, and I don't think it's a faulty PPU or any other chip on the board. So while I was thinking about this issue, I remembered that I do have a copy of Final Fantasy VI, obviously the Japanese version, because the US one is Final Fantasy III. And I thought, well, why not test out this original cartridge, see if it also has those glitching issues, and it doesn't. Whereas if I load up the exact same ROM with the Everdrive, we get those video glitches. So I thought, well, maybe there's something about the Everdrive. Like, I know people say it draws more power than an original cartridge, so maybe there's a power issue on this board. But I checked the 5-volt supply with the oscilloscope, and it looked pretty much the same with this cartridge and the Everdrive. So I thought, well, maybe it's not a power supply issue. So I started Googling and came across an interesting thread on Reddit. So this is from a couple of years ago, FX Pack Pro glitchy screen, which is what the SD to SNES is now called. SNES works fine with my OEM cartridges, but when I try the FX Pack Pro, it has a glitchy screen and black screen no matter the ROM. Firmware up to date, games do load, they're unplayable. I heard this might be due to failing capacitors, working on buy a replacement. Now, of course, I've already replaced the capacitors on this board and checked the power supply, so I don't think that's the issue. But scrolling down through some of the replies, I spotted this one from Felicium OD. In addition to what others said, if you have an early launch SNES, the SHVC, which is what this is, there are timing issues with that console that can cause screen glitching on some FX pack versions. There is a fix where you can insulate, tape one of the pins on the FX pack card to fix it, but this does remove MSU1 enhanced audio playback. So they don't actually mention what pin needs to be taped over, but I kept on Googling and came across this review here, which says, have an SHVC 01 SNES, issues with this cart, glitching graphics, blah blah blah. After some troubleshooting, it turned out my old console did not have a CPU clock buffer. The clock was just running off transistors. After some debugging a proper buffer off the crystal, the console started behaving itself and the cart worked like a dream. So that does kind of suggest that it's a timing issue, and some of the Everdrive cartridges and these particular boards don't play nicely, even though I've used this cart with other SHVC boards and it's worked just fine. So after more Googling, I came across this GitHub page where somebody has created a little clock buffer PCB. So it looks like this. So it's just a 7404, a little bypass cap, and the in and out for the actual clock signal. And they say the purpose of this board is to fix the Everdrive issues with the SHVC 01 consoles. The original clock driver on these PCBs is extremely load sensitive. So this does all seem to point towards the same issue, and I think there's some photos here. Yeah, there we go. So there's their little board wired up to the clock circuit. So that looks like something worth trying on this board, but I want to try and solve this issue now rather than wait around for PCBs to arrive. So yeah, there is a little bit more information online, and this is probably the website that I should have looked at before anything else, the Console Mods Wiki, because it is a great source of information. And of course, I found a little bit more info on this. The scrambled screen issue pretty much says the same thing that we've already found, and I think Durf has a little video on his YouTube channel of this issue. Let's just play this. So he's loading up Super Mario World. Looks all good. And then that happens. So yeah, that's a lot worse than what we're seeing with this board, but in the video description, he says that he actually sent his console to Akari, who I believe actually did the code for the SD to SNES, and then Krix does the actual Everdrive cartridges. He did some deep troubleshooting and figured out a fix that will be added in the new FX Pack Pro board, so I'm guessing the new Everdrives don't suffer from this issue, but I have an older cartridge here. Alternatively, installing a DFO mod will fix this permanently. You can temporarily fix this by covering the leftmost pin on the front and back of the cart with tape to fix it, though that will break the MSU1 and some special chip games. So there we go. It seems you have to be pretty unlucky to come across this issue, but we've got it right here. So let's see if we can fix this without ordering a PCB. Before we do that, let's have a look on the oscilloscope at this clock signal. So if we turn the console on and have a look at pin 31 on PPU2, that should have our master clock signal. And yeah, it's pretty low. It's around 2.6, 2.7 volts, but it is at the right frequency, around 21.47 megahertz. Now, if we swap the Everdrive over for an original cartridge and take another look, there's our clock signal, same frequency, but now it's around 3.1 volts amplitude. So yeah, the Everdrive definitely pulls it down a little bit. The fix for this, as they mentioned, was to tape over one of the pins on this cartridge, and it's the leftmost pins. So let's tape over them, see what it looks like. So I'll throw a little bit of Kapton tape, pretty much just tape off all of these pins on this side because it should still work. A standard cartridge doesn't actually have those pins. It's more for the enhancement chip cartridges that actually use them. That should do it. Let's put this back in, power on, and now if we look at our clock signal, if my ground clip would stay on there, we're back up to 3.1 volts, so just like it was with an original cartridge. And if we have a look at the video output now, And we can see all of our glitching has stopped, but because we've taped over these pins now, there's certain games like Super Mario Kart, which does use one of the enhancement chips, it no longer works. So not the ideal solution, but at least we know what we need to do to solve this problem. We just need to buffer that clock signal somehow. Of course, the other option that was mentioned is to install a DFO, which I might do in the future, but I don't particularly want to do that right now. And apparently the later Everdrive versions have a 100 ohm resistor on pin 1 of the cartridge, followed by a 5.6 microhenry inductor. So I don't really want to mess around with the actual cartridge itself. I'd rather solve the actual issue on the board here. So here's what I've got in mind. So looking at the schematics of the Super Nintendo, these obviously aren't the original. This was redrawn by somebody, does it say? Jonathan Donaldson. This kind of covers most of the board revisions, so it's not going to be totally accurate for the SHVC board, but looking around up here somewhere, here's our master clock just there, 21.477 megahertz. And you can see on these schematics it runs through 2 buffers here. And I think that is true for the later revision boards, so anything after the SHVC. But for these first revision boards, it doesn't actually go through any of these buffer circuits. Fortunately, this HCU04 is actually present on these boards, and you can see down here there are a couple of spare gates. Now on these boards, I poked around at it, and it is U9 over here. Let's move this out of the way. And what I found is this side of the chip is buffering the 4 megahertz crystal, and the other side, every second pin is just tied to ground. So these are all unused. So what I'm thinking is we use these inputs over here to buffer our 21 megahertz crystal. Now the clock signal does of course run to these 2 PPUs. It also goes to the CPU and the cartridge port, possibly elsewhere as well. So we need to find a point where we can sever that clock signal, run it through a couple of buffers, and then reinsert it. And it seems the best place to do that is the same one that was recommended on that GitHub page, which is just around C5, this one here. So I think what I want to do is cut this trace here and then run a wire which will have our clock signal on it over to the 7404 buffer, run it through a couple of those gates, and then out of that reconnect it to the main clock circuit, which I guess probably the PPUs would be the easiest place to do that. So we should have continuity from this point here to pin 1 on the cartridge connector, and obviously that also goes to the PPUs and the CPU. So I'm going to cut this trace just after this little pad here. That should do it. Let's just double check. Yes, our trace is cut. All right, now we need to run a wire from this pad over to our 7404, and we also need to free up a couple of inputs on this. So I'm just going to cut these 2 traces that come from the ground plane here. There is one more gate here. I'll just leave that connected to ground. I don't think we need to go through 3 gates, and these will invert at each output. So it's going to get inverted twice. All right, let's double check that. So we should have no continuity to ground here and nothing here. Yep, that seems good. And I did also remove this chip from a parts board just to inspect the traces underneath. And yeah, it's only the inputs of these gates that actually are connected to ground. The outputs are just floating. So we'll prep this little pad just here. All right, that seems good. Now, I do want to try and keep this wire away from any interference, so I'm going to try and run it around the outside of the board across this ground plane. But I do have to keep in mind that once the board's in a case, it actually sits on these raised bits here. So I want to keep it sort of far away from these screw holes as possible. And I can't run it over to the top side because normally there's an RF shield that sits over this part. So it'll just get crushed by that. So I'm going to keep it fairly close to the inside of this board. I think my best bet here is just a little dab of glue every so often. Alright, that should do. It mostly stays along this ground plane. Obviously around here I tried to keep it away from these capacitors, so sort of through the middle and then across the rest of this ground plane and up over here right to our 7404. So this wire is going to connect to pin 13. Very good. Just make sure I didn't bridge anything. We are good there. And it shouldn't be connected to pin 1 over here at the moment, which it is not. Cool. So pin 13 is the input on one of the buffers, which comes out at pin 12, and then pin 11 is the input to the next buffer, which comes out on pin 10. So I just need to connect 12 and 11 together, and then 10 will be our final output. So this should be pretty easy to do with just a blob of solder, just like that. And then we just need to prep pin 10. Looks good. Probably should have used some external flux, but that's okay. I think this will be fine. It seems happy. So I'm just going to run it past this capacitor straight over to pin 31 on PPU 2. Throw a little bit of solder on here. That's quite a bit. Right, so pin 31 should now be connected to pin 10 over here, and it's not bridged. That should be connected to the other PPU and pin 1 on the cartridge port. That all looks good. Pins 11 and 12 over here are connected together, and then pin 13 goes from here. And that should be all the way over on this pad down here, and this capacitor. Perfect. That should be our clock signal properly buffered. Alright, better put the sound module back on. I won't plug in a cartridge just yet, just in case. We'll just plug in, just need power and a switch really. Alright, we'll just have a look on the scope what our clock signal now looks like. Power on. Ooh, yes. Much bigger amplitude. We're now, yeah, pretty much rail to rail, just about 4.7 volts. I'm happy with that. Let's put the original cartridge on first, see if it makes much of a difference. I doubt it will. Still 4.7 volts. Is the game actually working? Help if I had video output plugged in. Game is not working. Nothing. That's not a good sign. Oh, I think it's just a bad connection. I need to give this a proper clean, I think. There we go. The game is running. Our clock signal looks pretty damn good, 4.7 volts. Let's try the Everdrive. Probably need a controller for this. Oh, probably should take that tape off there first. Yeah. Come on. Ah. Now it's gonna fucking rip apart on me. Alright. Tape is removed. Power on. Everdrive is working. Not seeing any glitches, and our clock signal still nice and solid, 4.7 volts. Beautiful. Let's fire up a game. Super Mario Kart. Don't see any issues there. See if I can play this through the laggy OBS interface. Out of the way, Nico. What are you doing? It's gonna come back to haunt me. Sweet. I think this problem is finally fixed. That was quite a tangent. I really didn't expect to find an issue like this, and I've never heard about it before, but there we go. Apparently these boards and the older Everdrives may suffer from little video glitches like that, or potentially much worse. So I'm glad I managed to fix this board without removing any of the chips, because I would have gone ahead and removed PPU2 and then probably PPU1 and then probably the CPU and then SRAM and VRAM and whatever else, and wouldn't have got anywhere with it. So yeah, I'm glad I found that out. It's just a shame that it's not better documented anywhere, but well, if you've watched this video, now you know. So there we go. I didn't expect to be messing around with the first board for this long. I was hoping that we'd get maybe 2 or 3 boards done in this video, but I think this has definitely gone on long enough. And yeah, this was quite a different issue from what I was expecting. The good thing is we've managed to be very resourceful and reuse a couple of spare gates that Nintendo left for us. Perhaps they should have used them themselves. Anyway, I think we should leave this one here. We'll definitely do some more Super Nintendo repairs, and I also have a special little mod planned for the Super Nintendos, not just the original boards, but pretty much all versions except for the SNES Mini, or SNES Junior, whatever it's called. But we'll get back to that in a future video. So thank you all for watching. A huge thanks to the people that support the channel on Patreon. If you want to do the same, links to that are in the video description. You'll get ad-free early access to all videos and help the channel continue growing. Of course, like and subscribe. All that YouTube bullshit also helps. And yeah, that is it for this one. So thank you for watching. Bye. All right, now I want to play Final Fantasy. But I can't read Japanese.